In the last lecture module, we looked at motivations that have been forwarded as reasons or rationales why functionalism is a good theory about the nature of mental states. In this lecture module, we're going to turn our attention to some differentiations, some distinctions within functionalism and between functionalism and logical behaviorism. So we'll start with two versions of functionalism that Bloch discusses in this article. Functional state identifiers, what he refers to as functional state identity theory, think that pain and any mental state is going to be a functionally specified kind or category, with instances that likely cut across particular physical kinds or categories. Thus, functional state identifiers are going to hold that any or many mappings of functional states to physical states of a system that preserve the laws of that psychological theory are going to specify instances of a particular mental state, like pain. So, for the functional state identifiers, even creatures that have very dissimilar nervous systems to us. So, octopi is an example that Putnam uses, lobsters, reptiles, creatures that differ from us significantly but satisfy, at least potentially satisfy, some of the major elements of the functional characterization of what it is to be in pain. They would all have instances of pain identified because they shared those common functional causal relationships. Now, in contrast to the functional state identifiers who associate what it is to be a pain with having those causal dispositions, those relationships between inputs, internal states, and outputs, functional specifiers, or advocates of functional specification theory, they're going to view mental states, or the terms that pick out mental states, as things, specific types that are picked out by those definite descriptions that are associated with the functional role played by a particular mental term in a particular psychological theory. So while Putnam and maybe Fodor would be willing to talk about pain in terms of both C fiber stimulation in human beings and high activation of the brachial mass in octopi, functional specifiers will talk about pain as being, say, C fiber stimulations, and they would look at the functional specification of the brachial mass in octopi and say, no, that doesn't count. Brachial masses aren't the same as C fibers. Let's finish this lecture module by looking at the ways in which Bloch wants to differentiate functionalism and logical behaviorism. So Bloch wants to claim that logical behaviorists are fictionalists about the mental, and hence they cannot allow that mental states have causal powers. Now, I don't think that characterization is accurate. I think it's very misleading. Logical behaviorists analyze the meanings of mental terms using behavioral dispositions. So pain is just a disposition to behave a certain way, like solubility is just the disposition to dissolve when placed in a liquid solvent. Logical behaviorists argue that such behavioral dispositions prove adequate both to capture our ordinary meaning when we use mental terminology and for our explanatory and predictive needs in ordinary life. Hence, nothing is added in those contexts by the supposition of additional causes. If we understand logical behaviorists as arguing that overt behavioral dispositions prove adequate both to capture our ordinary meaning and for our explanatory and predictive needs, one might understand Chisholm and Putnam's criticisms of logical behaviorism as asserting that mere overt behavioral dispositions prove inadequate to explain and predict intelligent behavior. Instead, theorists must understand mental terms by understanding how mental states bring about, or fail to bring about, various overt behaviors through a more fine-grained functional analysis. So suppose we use solubility as an analogy. Putnam and Chisholm would make the claim that in order to understand various phenomena like rates of dissolution, equilibrium solubility, and the difference between water solubility and water insolubility, one must consider the causal interaction of a number of factors. For instance, the physical and chemical properties of the solute and solvent, as well as the temperature, pressure, and presence of other chemicals in the solution. All of those things will affect the solubility of a substance. However, none of that, I think, commits logical behaviorists to fictionalism. At least I don't think so. While Hempel and Ryle don't explicitly commit either way, really, they both seem open to the possibility that neurological explanations of those dispositions that they refer to might occur, so long as those explanations fall under the umbrella of, say, for instance, in Hempel's case, verificationism. The intermediate steps introduced by such accounts do not seem to pose problems for logical behaviorists. Indeed, Hempel would likely feel compelled to accept such developments given the unity of science. Likewise, in a paper Ordinary Language that Ryle published in 1953, he says, if we are inquiring into problems of perception, i.e. discussing questions about the concepts of seeing, hearing, and smelling, we might be taken to be tackling the questions of opticians, neurophysiologists, or psychologists, and even fall into this mistake ourselves. It is then salutary to keep on reminding ourselves and one another that what we are after is accounts of how certain words work, namely words like see, look, overlook, blind, visualize, and lots of other affiliated expressions. How then are we to understand Bloch's attempts to distance functionalism from logical behaviorism? Well, the two views are not completely antithetical to one another. Both views are attempting to understand the meanings of mental terms in terms of a functional relationship. In the case of logical behaviorism, the functional relationship is a relatively simple linear relationship between stimulus and response. In the case of functionalism, that functional relationship is a more complicated relationship between stimulus, internal mental states, and responses. Moreover, many functionalists have strong logical behaviorist sympathies. However, functionalism does differ from logical behaviorism in two important respects. Functionalists assume that mental terms refer to causally active entities, like mental states. Then they are real things that have real causes. They're not agnostic about the existence of internal mental states. Functionalism also depends upon the interrelationships between mental states to functionally characterize the role of each mental state in the overall cognitive economy. And finally, functionalists want to go from an analysis of the meaning of mental terms to a claim about the reference of those terms out in the physical world.